You wrote about a week or so ago in the American Conservative an article called Ideas for Candidates Beyond Talking Points. And you list 10 things in there. There are recommendations and things that they should be talking about. I want to talk about 3 of these in particular because I think they're really relevant. Number 1, you say, basically, instead of worrying about Ukraine, we should be securing America's borders.
We not only need to secure the borders, once we do that, and it's going to take military power to ensure that it is actually secured, and that's probably 40, 50, 60,000 troops. We also have to secure our harbors, our ports, because a lot pours in through our ports like San Francisco, New York City. We have to secure the Canadian border as well. If you go up to the Great Lakes, that area is being a major drug supply route for a long time. So we have a lot of work to do around our borders and littoral waters. The United States Coast Guard that's running around in the South China Sea or the Persian Gulf needs to come home and do its job where it belongs here in the United States. Those kinds of things have to happen. But we've also got to expel the people that have come here illegally. These people can't stay. If you look at the state of our economy, the fragility of our financial condition, leaving these people here is a catalyst for serious trouble and unrest. We're not, daddy warbucks that can afford to do everything contrary to what Mr. Biden and his friends think. And there are ways to do this. You can give everybody 90 days to get out and then tell them that those of you who register on the way out with us will put your names on a list. And at some future point in time, hopefully in the next 5, 10 years, whatever it is, when we are in better financial condition and better economic situation, we can consider readmitting you legally. And anybody who refuses to do that, well, you're going to have to incarcerate them and then forcibly expel them. But that's the sort of thing we absolutely have to do. That's the number 1 priority, or this country will go away. Our no borders means no country, ultimately.
Yeah. And Gary, can you bring that list back up again? The second one you have there is defend America first. I wonder if you can explain what your intent is with that.
Well, we've been through a long period now, certainly beginning, I would say, in 1965 with Vietnam, of military adventurism, military interventionism. In other words, spreading democracy and American notions of governance at gunpoint or bayonet point. That's really got to end. It's absolutely got to end. And we need to take a different approach to the rest of the world. We need to make it abundantly clear that unless someone attacks us directly or attacks our vital strategic interests, and we need to identify what those are, and we can do that, we're not going to use military power. That has to happen. See, the whole world is sick of us because at the drop of a hat, we commit the U.S. Armed Forces to bully our way in and to bully people everywhere to do what we want them to do. We've got to stop that. So defend America first means exactly that. We're going to defend ourselves in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to defend our interests, defend our citizens, and we'll do that vigorously. But we're going to stop intervening in and operating in other people's countries because it's lawless. It needs to go away.
And it's so ironic that our actual laws, not to mention the Constitution, but the 1973 War Powers Act expressly states that, number 1, only the Congress has the power to declare war to bring us into conflict. But secondly, even in emergency situations, the only authorization is for use by the administration is if we're being attacked or an imminent attack or our soldiers or our interests elsewhere. That's it. There are no other exceptions without having to have a pre-authorized from the United States Congress. So basically all you're saying is let's follow the laws that we have, and that would be a lot better at it.
Well, yes, although I think we should say as a priority, defend America first. In other words, hemispheric defense, number 1. And that means we don't need all of these bases overseas. That's the legacy of a world that doesn't exist anymore. And you and I have talked about it, how profoundly technology has changed military power as well as economics. And we've got to come on board and understand that. So the notion of all these forward deployed forces as vital to our security is exactly wrong. Yeah. The opposite is the case. And whatever you have forward in the event of a real conflict is probably going to go away quickly. That's the issue.
And I think that tails into the third point that I wanted to look at. Jeffrey, thank you there. You say you want to build new armed forces for the 21st century. So I wonder if you can explain in the time we have left. I know that's a big point there, but what is your position that we should do to change?
Well, keep in mind that whoever is elected or whoever ends up running the country in the near future is going to confront a terrible situation from a financial economic standpoint. You cannot do what Donald Trump wants to do, cut taxes and sort of march down the Reagan-esque road. That's what Liz Truss did in England, and she was summarily bounced out of power for it. That's not the answer. We're going to have to radically cut spending. We have effectively $1 trillion defense budget. And I say $1 trillion because I lumped the intelligence agencies in with the Department of Defense. You add it up, it's $1 trillion. That has to be cut in half. Think about that. You've got to cut $500 billion out of that. You're going to end up having to deal with entitlements. And we have at least 2,000 programs that fall into that particular category that nobody wants to touch. Everybody's afraid to touch it. It's going to have to go. So the military side is not going to be immune to this sort of thing. Remember, this is the guns versus butter problem. George W. Bush decided we could have both guns and butter. And here we are, 22, 24 years later with guns and butter, and we're broke. The machine is going to seize up. It's unsustainable. What did Ben Stein say? You know, when something can no longer operate, it stops. Seems self-evident, but he's right. Ben Stein's right. We're just going to stop dead in our tracks. So then you have to cut everything dramatically. When you begin to cut things dramatically, that means you have to scale back your strategic interests and expectations. And our strategic interests have been global military hegemony. Well, that's absurd. You know, it always was crazy. So we don't want it, we don't need it, and the world doesn't want it. So we're going to have to re-examine how much we spend, where we spend it, how we spend it. Now, I haven't even talked about the technological aspects. I'm just talking on the highest level strategically. That's what we're looking at in the next year to 2 years.
And so now when some people hear cut the defense budget, they automatically think, and certainly a number of people will actively facilitate this thought that, oh my gosh, you're going to make us less secure. So how do you argue that cutting the defense budget can actually make us more secure?
Well, $1 trillion defense budget apparently has failed miserably to secure us, because we're told every time someone testifies from the Department of Defense that we have all these enemies all over the world for which we have to arm ourselves to the teeth, and then we have to be prepared to preemptively attack and destroy them. Now, this is nonsense. So you're talking about a change in the threat picture, and that change is we have to live in the world that exists, not in the fantasy world that Washington prefers. And that fantasy world is everything is being forcibly shaped in the direction we want it to go. And we have this amazing military establishment that can destroy and kill anybody. Therefore, everybody has to do what we say. Those days are over. This is really what Putin was trying to say. He's not the only one. I listened to the foreign minister from Singapore say the same thing. You know, we are clinging to this post-war so-called liberal international order. We can debate whether or not that nomenclature makes any sense, but it's gone. It's over with. And this all emerged when we were the last man standing at the end of the Second World War. And that's all gone. So that is the first thing, is to re-examine the world and see it as it really is, and understand that it may be a far better way to operate without provoking wars, without precipitating interventions, without preemptively striking. We'll end up living in a much better world. We managed to live in that world very successfully for a long time, and the world loved us. There's no reason why we can't do that in the future. But we can be prudent about it. But we should be most prudent about defending ourselves at home, our territory, our citizens, and as I said, those vital strategic interests, which have a lot to do with access to the global commons, space, ocean, sea, resources, and so forth. And then you have to re-examine what we're doing on the battlefield these days. I mean, the U.S. military is not organized, equipped, and structured to fight effectively in this new environment. And if you want to know what that new environment is, look at Ukraine. And imagine that new environment, which involves top attack from all sorts of weapon systems, is only going to grow more lethal in the future. So how do you deal with it? And I always try to point out that the size of our theater, air, and missile defense investment and force is almost exactly what it was 30 years ago. That's ridiculous. But that tells you something about the mindset in the Department of Defense.
Yeah, it really does. And I remember when you came up with a lot of these Transformation Under Fire and some of these other books that you had about how to reorganize and refit the U.S. Armed Forces. It always struck me that by having a concurrent change of structure with a strategy would make us stronger and cost a lot less. And that's the irony of how this could all work. That
Well,
it's
Dan,
counterintuitive to a lot.
Dan, thanks for saying that, because if I were going to pick a good example of it, where it worked very effectively, it's actually an example of Lenin in 1923-24. Remember, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists ended up fighting all sorts of internal enemies, killing millions of people, but they also had to face some external enemies. They had the Japanese that entered eastern Siberia. We came in against them along with the British, the French, and others in northern Russia. Ultimately, it all failed, and the communists came out on top. But to fight and win that war, the communists had to raise the size of what we would then have called the Bolshevik armies or the Red Armies to about 6 million. And then by 1922-23, it became clear, having won, that they were going to have to dramatically reduce that. And so Lenin reduced the size of the so-called Red Army, which at that point was a little over 5 million, down to 600,000. Now, keep in mind that Russia, or the Soviet Union at that point, was the largest country in the world in terms of landmass, bordered more countries than any other country in the world. And yet they were able to go down to 600,000. Suddenly, all the external enemies, which the communists had ranted and raved about, were no longer the issue. The issue was, we have to extract savings. We have to husband resources so that we can build the scientific industrial base that we need for the future. And so that 600,000 man force in the Soviet Union actually became the small seed that grew by 1939 into several million men and a modern force with all of the equipment that we're familiar with today. Well, we need a similar approach, because most of the equipment we're using is not designed for this new world that we're living in. And it's going to take time. But your first step is much like what Lenin said. And just do the math and look at going from 5+ million down to 600,000, and remember who they are, where they live, and the numbers of countries they border. And they managed to do that and pull it off successfully. Certainly, we could do at least that well. And I'm not saying we go down to 600,000 men, but it may end up being something like that. And that's the model I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I really reinforce the necessity of changing the strategy as well, or having one, I guess. In that,
and remember,
instead of saying everybody's our enemy everywhere.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the strategy up until that point was to expand the revolution. In other words, we're going to carry the Bolshevik revolution on our bayonets through Poland, into Germany, and all over Europe. Well, that failed. They were annihilated in front of Warsaw by the Polish armies. And at that point, everybody said, wait a minute, this isn't working. We can't conquer the world with the forces we have. And they fell back into the Soviet Union. And they changed their strategy. And eventually, Stalin called it socialism in one country. In other words, homeland defense. That's where we're going to focus. And that's what we need to do.